What's the creepiest unsolved pattern researchers have noticed? Story 1 in 2016, and again in 2018, a NASA balloon experiment called ANITA, the Antarctic Impulsive Transient Antenna, was floating above Antarctica, listening for radio pulses produced when ultra-high energy cosmic rays slam into the ice below. The experiment had been designed and was working exactly as intended, and then it detected something it wasn't supposed to be able to detect. The radio pulses came from below the horizon. Not from space, not from the ice, from below the horizon, as if ultra-high energy particles had traveled upward through thousands of kilometers of Earth, emerged from the ground in Antarctica, and produced the signal that ANITA recorded. Ultra-high energy particles don't do this. The standard model of particle physics essentially prohibits it. Particles at the energy levels that ANITA detected are absorbed by matter, not transmitted through it, and certainly not through the full diameter of a planet. The ANITA team checked for experimental error and found none. They published. The anomaly appeared twice, in 2 separate flight campaigns. 2 is the kind of number that makes physicists uncomfortable. The proposed explanations span a wide range. Some papers suggest the anomaly could represent supersymmetric particles, hypothetical particles predicted by extensions to the standard model that don't currently have experimental evidence. Some suggest it could indicate a new class of neutrino interaction. Some suggest it's an experimental artifact that the team hasn't correctly identified. A minority of papers raise more exotic possibilities. No consensus has been reached. The anomaly is documented, replicated across 2 experiments, and currently unexplained within standard particle physics. Whatever produced the signal came from below a planet that it should not have been able to pass through. Story 2, the standard model of cosmology, the Lambda CDM model, predicts a universe in which matter is distributed with a particular statistical texture, denser regions and emptier regions, but with fluctuations of a specific character and scale. When cosmologists look at the distribution of galaxies on very large scales, they expect to find a universe that, while structured at smaller scales, approaches homogeneity above roughly 200 to 300 million light-years. The KBC void is approximately 1 billion light-years across. That's 2 to 3 times larger than the structures that cosmological models predict should exist. The void was named for researchers Keenan, Barger, and Cowie, who published analysis in 2013 suggesting that Earth is located near the center of an unusually underdense region of the universe, a region where the density of galaxies and matter is roughly 20% below the cosmic average, extending for about 500 million light-years in all directions. The implications, if the void is real rather than a statistical fluctuation, are significant. Being inside an unusually underdense region would affect the local expansion rate of space. The rate at which galaxies near us are receding would appear higher than the true average cosmic expansion rate. This is relevant because of the Hubble tension. The observed local expansion rate of the universe is measurably higher than what's predicted from the early universe parameters. The KBC void is one of several proposals for explaining this discrepancy. Whether the KBC void is real, how large it is, and whether we're actually near its center are all actively debated. The possibility that Earth occupies a cosmically unusual location, not special in a design sense, but statistically improbable, is uncomfortable in a specific way that cosmologists keep returning to. Story 3, the cosmic microwave background, is the thermal afterglow of the early universe, a map of temperature variations from approximately 380,000 years after the Big Bang. It has been mapped with extraordinary precision by 3 successive satellite missions, and its properties match the predictions of standard cosmology remarkably well in almost every respect. Almost. There is a region in the southern sky covering roughly 1.8 billion light-years where the CMB temperature is measurably colder than the surrounding average by a small but statistically significant amount. Measured in the Planck data, this cold spot has been present in every dataset since it was first identified in the WMAP data in 2004. It is real. The proposed explanations are instructive. The most mundane, the cold spot, is a statistical fluctuation, the kind of large-scale anomaly you'd expect to occasionally find in a large dataset, and that appears in some simulations. The problem is that in most CMB simulations, cold spots as cold as this one appear in fewer than 1 or 2% of runs, which makes it an unusual feature even as statistical fluctuations go. The more interesting explanations require new physics. A supervoid, a massive underdense region between us and the cold spot, could in principle produce temperature anomalies through the late integrated Sachs-Wolf effect. Some searches have found candidate supervoid structures in the direction of the cold spot, but not reliably enough to be definitive. The most exotic explanation, that the cold spot represents a scar from a collision between our universe and another in a multiverse scenario, is taken seriously by some cosmologists and dismissed as untestable speculation by others. The cold spot has been in the data for 20 years. It is still there. Nobody has agreed on why. Story 4 fast radio bursts are millisecond duration pulses of intense radio emission from cosmological distances, billions of light years away, that were first detected in 2007 and have since been detected in the hundreds. Most are one-off events, they burst once and are never detected again from the same source. A small fraction repeat, FARB 121102, was the first repeating fast radio burst to be identified, localized to a dwarf galaxy approximately 3 billion light-years away, and studied over a long baseline. The repetition pattern that emerged from long monitoring is what makes it specifically strange. The burst source is active for approximately 4 days, goes silent for approximately 12 days, becomes active again, repeats the cycle. The periodicity is approximately 157 days. And within that cycle, the bursts cluster into active and inactive windows with an approximately 16-day rhythm. No confirmed astrophysical model cleanly explains this pattern. The proposed mechanisms include a precessing magnetar, a type of collapsed stellar remnant whose emission beam sweeps across our line of sight with a geometric period. Another proposal involves a binary system in which the neutron star's beam is periodically obscured or enhanced by a companion's wind. A third proposal involves the orbital period of the burst source itself around a central object. Each of these mechanisms has difficulties fitting all the observed properties. The period is regular enough to have been tracked reliably across years of monitoring. It's too regular to be random noise. It's too specific to be easily explained by any of the natural periodicities that astrophysics readily produces. Whatever is producing FARB 121102 is doing so on a schedule. We don't know whose schedule it is. Story 5 across the grasslands of Namibia's Namib Desert, and more recently identified in the Pilbara region of Western Australia, circular patches of bare, grassless soil appear in regular patterns across the landscape, evenly spaced, nearly perfectly circular, ranging from 2 to 15 meters in diameter, and apparently stable for decades. Aerial photography makes the pattern visually striking. Millions of bare circles dotting the red soil, ringed by grass, in patterns that look almost deliberate. The fairy circles have attracted scientific attention not just because of their visual regularity, but because their specific spacing and size distribution follow mathematical patterns that appear in other self-organizing systems. Two main explanations have been proposed and vigorously defended. The termite hypothesis proposes that Namibian sand termites clear vegetation around their nest sites, creating the bare patches, and that the circle's spacing reflects the territorial dynamics of competing colonies. Proponents point to the presence of termite activity in fairy circle soil and to the circle's persistence. The self-organization hypothesis proposes that the pattern emerges from competition between grass plants for water in an arid environment, that the circles represent zones where grasses have died out due to resource depletion, and that the regular spacing is produced by the interaction of positive and negative feedbacks in plant growth. Proponents point to mathematical models that produce similar spacing from these dynamics without requiring termites. The most recent proposed resolution, both mechanisms operate simultaneously, and the pattern results from their interaction. Whether this is correct or whether one mechanism dominates in specific conditions remains actively debated in the ecology literature. The circles look like something left by something. They were left by competition. Story 6: Mass whale strandings. Certain coastlines see them repeatedly, and the pattern makes no sense. Mass strandings. Events in which multiple whales, dolphins, or other cetaceans beach themselves simultaneously or in rapid succession in the same location occur at specific coastlines repeatedly, across decades and centuries, in ways that suggest something about the geography rather than about specific individuals. Golden Bay in New Zealand, the Outer Hebrides in Scotland, Cape Cod in Massachusetts. These sites see strandings at rates dramatically above comparable coastlines, repeatedly, with different whale populations over time. The causes of mass strandings are multiple and not fully understood even for individual events. Military sonar, specifically mid-frequency active sonar, is implicated in a specific category of strandings, particularly of beaked whales, where the mechanism involves nitrogen bubble formation in blood and tissues analogous to decompression sickness. This mechanism is supported by specific pathological findings and by the temporal correlation of strandings with naval exercises. But this explanation doesn't account for most strandings. Many mass strandings occur without any sonar activity in the region. Some occur in locations and at times where strandings have been documented for centuries before sonar existed. The geographic clustering at specific coastlines suggests something about those locations, their specific bathymetry, their geomagnetic properties, their acoustic characteristics that make cetaceans navigating near them more likely to misread their position. The geomagnetic hypothesis proposes that whales navigating by the Earth's magnetic field are misled by local magnetic anomalies in coastal areas that cause them to perceive deep water where shallow water exists. Some analyses of stranding sites find geomagnetic properties consistent with this. The correlation is not clean. The strandings continue. The coastlines accumulate their histories. The explanation for why it keeps being those coastlines remains incomplete. Story 7: Periodical cicadas count prime numbers every 13 or 17 years. No other intervals and no complete explanation. Periodical cicadas, the species of the genus Magicicada found in eastern North America, spend the vast majority of their lives underground as nymphs, emerging as adults to reproduce, and then dying in population pulses that occur every 13 or 17 years depending on the brood. Not 12 or 14 years, not 15 or 18. 13 and 17, both prime numbers, both highly specific, both remarkably precise individual cicadas in a brood emerge synchronously, within days of each other, after spending exactly their species' characteristic interval underground. The prime number quality of the life cycles has attracted mathematical and evolutionary attention specifically because it is not obvious why prime numbers would be selected for. Several hypotheses have been proposed. The predator satiation hypothesis: by emerging in enormous numbers, cicadas overwhelm any predator that might specialize in eating them. The prime number intervals reduce the probability that a predator species with a different cyclical population dynamic would synchronize with the cicada emergence if your prey only emerges every 13 years. A predator that cycles every 2, 3, 4, 5, or 6 years will only occasionally synchronize with it, whereas if the cicada emerged every 12 years, a predator cycling every 2, 3, 4, or 6 years would synchronize regularly. The hybridization avoidance hypothesis: if two broods with different cycle lengths ever emerged in the same location simultaneously, they might hybridize and produce offspring with intermediate cycle lengths. Prime number cycles reduce this risk, because two different prime cycles share almost no common multiples. Neither explanation is fully satisfying on its own, and the specific mechanism by which individual cicadas count 13 or 17 years underground with extreme precision is not yet understood at the molecular level. Story 8: The Dowse hum, a persistent low-frequency sound that only 2% of people can hear and nobody has traced since approximately 1991. a subset of residents of Taos. New Mexico, estimated at roughly 2% of the population, have reported hearing a persistent low-frequency hum with no identifiable source. The Taos hum, as it became known, has the character of a diesel engine idling in the middle distance, low-pitched, continuous, with occasional variations in intensity, audible indoors more than outdoors, and worse at night when ambient noise levels are lower. The people who hear it find it disturbing enough that some have left the area. The pattern is not unique to Taos. Similar persistent hums have been reported by significant minorities of residents in Bristol, United Kingdom, Windsor, Ontario, and various other specific locations globally. The geographic specificity is itself notable. The hum is reported in specific places, not uniformly, suggesting something about those locations rather than something about the people who report it. Investigation of the Taos hum commissioned by Congress in the 1990s examined the area with an array of sensors and could not identify an acoustic source. The sensors didn't detect the hum, but people, a consistent minority, did. Seismic activity was investigated. Underground industrial installations were investigated. Nothing explained it. The 2% hearing it phenomenon is itself a clue that hasn't led anywhere definitive. Either the hum is real and 2% of people can detect it for some physiological reason, or the hum is generated internally by some people, a form of tinnitus or otoacoustic emission, with the geographic clustering reflecting some shared environmental trigger. The hum continues to be reported. The source continues to be unidentified. The 98% who can't hear it have no way to evaluate the experience of the 2% who can. Story 9, the fine-tuning problem. The universe's constants are precisely set for life, and nobody knows why the fundamental constants of physics, numbers like the cosmological constant, the ratio of electromagnetic to gravitational force strength, the mass of the electron relative to the proton, and a dozen others, appear to be set with extraordinary precision to values that permit the existence of stars, chemistry, and life. If you changed any of them by small amounts, the consequences would be catastrophic. A slightly larger cosmological constant would have caused the early universe to expand so fast that matter never clumped into galaxies. A slightly different ratio of forces would mean no stable atoms or no stable stars. This observation, that the constants seem fine-tuned for the existence of life, is not disputed. The constants are what they are. Life requires that they fall in a narrow range. They fall in that range. The dispute is about what this means. The multiverse interpretation. If an enormous number of universes exist with varying physical constants, and we necessarily find ourselves in one that permits our existence, the fine-tuning is a selection effect rather than a design. We're here to observe the universe because we're in one of the universes that permits observers. The design interpretation, the fine-tuning, reflects intentional construction. The unknown physics interpretation. There may be deeper principles of physics that require the constants to have their observed values, and the fine-tuning reflects our incomplete understanding rather than genuine contingency. The pure coincidence interpretation. Improbable things happen, and this is one of them. No scientific measurement can distinguish between these interpretations because they all predict the same observable universe. The fine-tuning is real. Its meaning is genuinely unresolvable with available methods, which is a specific kind of philosophical discomfort that physics rarely produces. Story 10, sonoluminescence. A bubble hit with sound produces light as hot as the surface of the sun. Sonoluminescence is the production of light from collapsing bubbles. When a gas bubble suspended in liquid is driven to oscillate by a sound field, under the right conditions, the bubble collapses so rapidly that the gas inside it reaches extraordinary conditions. Temperatures estimated between 10 and 20,000 Kelvin, as hot as the surface of the sun, and possibly considerably hotter, confined within a space only micrometers across, for a duration of picoseconds. At those temperatures and pressures, light is emitted. This is not theoretical. It can be produced in a tabletop experiment. The light has been measured, photographed, and studied extensively since the 1930s, when it was first accidentally observed. It is real. The mechanism by which the bubble produces light of that temperature from acoustic energy input that is thousands of times lower in energy is the part that isn't fully settled. Several mechanisms have been proposed: Bremsstrahlung radiation from ionized gas, blackbody radiation from the compressed plasma, quantum vacuum effects. No single mechanism accounts for all observed properties of the emitted light under all experimental conditions. A more exotic hypothesis proposed and subsequently largely dismissed, but never fully disproved, is that the conditions inside the collapsing bubble might approach those for nuclear fusion. A proposal that produced a brief excited period in the early 2000s before experimental tests failed to find the expected neutron emission that fusion would produce. The phenomenon is reproduced in laboratories around the world. The specific light spectrum varies with different dissolved gases and liquids. The temperatures involved are extreme by any standard that makes intuitive sense for an experiment done in a glass of water. The mechanism producing those temperatures from acoustic energy is still genuinely debated. Story 11, the double-slit experiment's observer effect. 100 years later, and it's still philosophically unresolved, the double-slit experiment is among the most replicated results in all of science and among the most genuinely mysterious. A particle, a photon, an electron, a molecule, is aimed at a barrier with two slits. When both slits are open and no measurement is made of which slit the particle passes through, the particles create an interference pattern on the detector behind the barrier, as if each particle passed through both slits simultaneously as a wave. When a detector is added to determine which slit the particle actually passed through, the interference pattern disappears, and the particles behave like classical particles passing through one slit or the other. The act of measurement, the presence of a detector that could in principle determine which slit the particle used, changes the physical outcome. Not the observation by a conscious being, just the physical presence of an apparatus capable of recording which path information. The universe, at the quantum level, behaves differently depending on whether information is extractable about particle paths. Physicists have known this for over a century. It has been confirmed with particles as large as carbon-60 buckyballs. It is one of the most robustly established experimental facts in physics. What it means is genuinely unresolved. The Copenhagen interpretation says there is no meaningful question about what the particle was doing before measurement. The measurement creates the outcome. Many worlds' interpretation says both paths are taken, and the detector interaction causes branching of the universe. Pilot wave theory proposes a deterministic physical mechanism that produces quantum statistics. Various other interpretations exist. The experiment's results are not in dispute. What the results mean about the nature of reality has been debated by the smartest physicists in the world for 100 years without producing consensus. It is the most replicated philosophical crisis in history. Story 12, bird magnetic navigation, uses quantum entanglement, and that's not the strangest part. Migratory birds navigate accurately across thousands of kilometers. This has been studied extensively, and some of the navigation is accounted for by familiar mechanisms: the sun's position, star patterns, landmark recognition. But birds also navigate accurately under overcast skies, at night, without landmarks, in ways that suggest a direct sensitivity to Earth's magnetic field. The mechanism that has emerged from research into cryptochrome proteins in birds' eyes is one of the genuinely strange intersections of biology and quantum mechanics. The current leading model proposes that light hitting specific molecules in the bird's retina creates a pair of electrons in a quantum entangled state, a radical pair, and that the relative orientation of these electron spins is affected by Earth's magnetic field in a way that influences the bird's subsequent visual processing. The bird may literally see the magnetic field as a pattern overlaid on its visual field. Quantum entanglement, the phenomenon in which the quantum states of two particles remain correlated regardless of distance, is the feature of quantum mechanics that Einstein called spooky action at a distance, and that he found philosophically unacceptable. It is now accepted physics. Its application to biological navigation is newer and still being worked out. The strangest part of the bird magnetic sense story is not the quantum mechanism, it's the scale at which it operates. Quantum effects are usually destroyed by thermal noise at biological temperatures, because the random vibration of molecules at body temperature tends to disrupt quantum coherence almost instantly. Yet the bird's magnetic sensor appears to maintain quantum coherence long enough to be useful for navigation at the temperature of a living bird, in the wet and noisy environment of a biological cell. This shouldn't work as well as it apparently does. It apparently does. Story 13 near-death experiences share features across cultures that have no shared culture. The cross-cultural consistency of near-death experience reports is one of the more genuinely puzzling findings in consciousness research, because the specific consistency is not the kind that could easily be explained by shared cultural transmission. The core features, reported by people from different countries, different religions, different cultural backgrounds, and different historical periods, include a sense of moving through a tunnel or dark passage toward a light, a panoramic review of one's life, experienced rapidly and with unusual clarity, a sense of profound peace, an encounter with beings or presences, and, in many cases, an experience of making a choice about whether to return to the body. These reports come from people who were clinically dead, no heartbeat, no brain activity as measured by EEG, and who were subsequently resuscitated. They come from people in Japan, India, the United States, Europe, and cultures with no historical contact. Some reports come from populations in the 19th century, before the modern archetype of the end was culturally established. The neurological explanations focus on documented events in the dying brain, oxygen deprivation producing specific patterns of neural activity, REM intrusion during cardiac events, endorphin release triggering specific experiential features. These mechanisms are real and produce some of the observed features. Whether they account for all the reported phenomenology, particularly the consistent life review and the specific quality of the described experience as more real than ordinary consciousness, is where the scientific consensus becomes less clear. The consistency of the features is the data. The mechanism that produces consistent features across unrelated cultures and historical periods is genuinely contested. Story 14 Savant Syndrome after brain injury. Extraordinary skills that appear from nowhere. Derek Amato had no particular musical ability when, in 2006, he dove into the shallow end of a swimming pool, hit his head on the bottom, and spent 4 days in hospital recovering from a severe concussion. Shortly after leaving hospital, he sat down at a piano, an instrument he had barely played, and began to play sophisticated original music for hours. He has continued to do so since, composing and performing at a professional level without conventional instruction. Amato is one of approximately 30 documented cases of acquired savant syndrome. People who developed extraordinary specific abilities following a brain injury or neurological event, such as a stroke or the onset of dementia, with no prior aptitude in that domain. The conditions from which acquired savant syndrome has developed include frontotemporal dementia, in which patients have developed unexpected artistic ability as the disease damages certain frontal lobe regions, stroke, in which damage to dominant hemisphere regions has occasionally released apparent mathematical or artistic capacities, and traumatic brain injury, as in Amato's case. The current leading theoretical framework draws on research by Daryl Trefford and others, the idea that the human brain contains dormant capacities that are normally suppressed by the dominant processing that occupies frontal lobe regions, and that injury to those regions can release lower-level processing capacities that then manifest as savant skills. The visual system, for example, might be capable of extraordinary perceptual analysis that is normally overridden by higher-level conceptual processing. The framework is interesting. The cases of people who sat down at a piano after a head injury and played, having never played before, remain difficult to fully account for. Story 15, colony collapse disorder. Entire bee colonies empty overnight with almost no bodies left. Starting in 2006, beekeepers across North America began reporting a specific and alarming pattern. Hives that had been healthy would, over a period of days to weeks, lose essentially their entire adult worker bee population. The queen would remain. Honey stores would remain. Brood, larvae at various developmental stages would remain. The adult workers would be gone. Crucially, unlike normal hive die-offs, there would be almost no dead adult bees inside or outside the hive. They had simply not come back. This became known as colony collapse disorder, and its specific quality, the disappearance rather than the death in place, complicated efforts to understand it. If the bees were dying en masse, researchers could examine the dead bees for pathogens, parasites, or chemical exposures. Without bodies, the investigation was substantially harder. Research over the following years identified several factors that correlate with CCD-affected colonies. Varroa destructor mites, parasites that suppress bee immune function and vector viral diseases, are consistently found at elevated levels in affected colonies. Neonicotinoid pesticides, a class of insecticide widely used on crops, have been shown in laboratory and field studies to impair the hive navigation ability of worker bees, potentially causing them to fail to return from foraging. Nutritional stress from monoculture agriculture and nosema gut parasites are additional contributing factors. The problem is that none of these factors, alone or in the combination studied, fully accounts for every documented CCD case. Some colonies collapse in areas with minimal pesticide exposure. Some with high Varroa loads don't collapse. The specific trigger that causes the adult worker population to simply not come home, leaving the hive structurally intact, is not definitively identified. The bees leave. They don't come back. We can't find them to understand why. Story 16, the universal flood myth. Unconnected civilizations around the world all have the same story. The specific consistency of flood mythology across cultures that had no historical contact is one of the genuine puzzles of comparative mythology. The Mesopotamian epic of Gilgamesh includes a flood narrative, the story of Utnapishtim, who builds a boat at divine instruction and survives a flood that destroys humanity, that predates the biblical account and shows remarkable structural similarities to it. The Hindu Matsya Purana describes Manu being warned by a fish to build a boat and survive a great flood. The Greek tradition has Deucalion building a chest and surviving a flood sent by Zeus. The Hopi have a flood narrative. Aboriginal Australians from multiple different language groups have flood myths. Mesoamerican cultures, including the Maya, have flood traditions. This is not a marginal observation. The motifs, divine warning, a specific individual or small group building a vessel or reaching high ground, the survival of humanity through this individual, and a post-flood world renewal appear in mythological traditions from populations that cannot have shared cultural transmission, including isolated island populations and pre-contact indigenous peoples of both hemispheres. The explanations anthropologists consider range from genuine shared memories of catastrophic flooding events in the early Holocene period to independent invention. The argument that dramatic flood events are among the most universally impactful natural disasters and that independent invention of flood mythology is not surprising given the experience of populations near rivers, coasts, and floodplains. The genuine flood memory explanation is not ridiculous. The end of the last ice age produced sea level rise of approximately 120 meters over several thousand years. That would have been dramatic. Story 17, Benford's Law. A mathematical pattern in nature that catches fraudsters and nobody fully understands why. In naturally occurring datasets, street addresses, stock prices, populations of cities, lengths of rivers, physical constants, electoral vote counts. The leading digit is not uniformly distributed. You would expect each digit from 1 through 9 to appear as the leading digit about 11% of the time. In naturally occurring data, The digit 1 appears as the leading digit approximately 30% of the time. The digit 2 appears approximately 18% of the time. The distribution follows a specific logarithmic curve, decreasing as the leading digit increases, with the digit 9 appearing only about 5% of the time. This is Benford's law, named for physicist Frank Benford, who documented it systematically in 1938, though it was first noted by astronomer Simon Newcomb in 1881. It applies across an astonishing range of naturally occurring datasets: the populations of all countries, the lengths of rivers in a geography database, the atomic weights of elements, the half-lives of radioactive isotopes, financial transactions in large datasets. The forensic applications are real. Tax authorities, financial regulators, and electoral monitoring organizations use Benford's law analysis to detect data that may have been fabricated or manipulated, because people inventing numbers tend to distribute leading digits more uniformly than naturally occurring data does. The explanation for why naturally occurring data follows this distribution is mathematical rather than mysterious. Datasets that span several orders of magnitude and arise from multiplicative processes tend to follow this distribution. The explanation is technically sound. What remains strange is the breadth of its application. The fact that the populations of the world's cities, the lengths of rivers, and the leading digits of physical constants all follow the same logarithmic pattern reflects something deep about how multiplicative processes generate data that we don't have an intuitive feel for. Story 18. The déjà vu mechanism. A universal human experience with no confirmed neural explanation. Déjà vu. The specific sensation of having experienced a situation before, when you know that you haven't, is reported by approximately 2/3 of the general population, making it one of the most common unusual experiences in human cognition. It's brief, typically lasting only seconds. It's reliably associated with a specific quality of experience: the knowledge that the familiarity is false, coexisting with the strong feeling of recognition. That combination, false familiarity that you simultaneously know is false, is the specific neurological puzzle. Whatever brain process produces déjà vu generates a familiarity signal that triggers the phenomenology of memory recognition without the actual memory that should accompany recognition, and in most cases without disrupting the person's knowledge that the recognition is inaccurate. The leading theories involve disruptions in the normal memory encoding process. One class of theories proposes that déjà vu arises when the familiarity signal from the memory system fires before the retrieval of specific episodic memory catches up, producing a moment of recognition without content. Another class involves the hippocampus briefly processing a current experience as if it were a retrieved memory rather than a new encoding. A third involves minor misfiring in the temporal lobe, supported by the fact that temporal lobe epilepsy frequently features déjà vu as an aura preceding seizures. None of these explanations has been confirmed as the primary mechanism in the neurologically normal population. Brain imaging during déjà vu is extremely difficult because the experience is brief, unpredictable, and cannot be reliably induced in an imaging context. Most of what we know comes from the clinical literature on temporal lobe epilepsy, which may not generalize to the experience in healthy people. You have probably experienced this. You don't know what caused it. Story 19. Left-handedness is exactly 10% of every human population ever studied, and nobody knows why. In every human population that has ever been systematically studied, across continents, across centuries, across radically different genetic backgrounds and cultural environments, approximately 1 in 10 people is left-handed. Not 9% in some populations and 14% in others, not trending upward or downward over recorded history. Roughly 10% consistently everywhere for as long as there is data. This is strange for several reasons. First, handedness has a strong genetic component. Left-handedness runs in families, but no single gene or small set of genes has been identified that determines it, despite extensive genome-wide association studies. Second, the consistent cross-cultural rate persists even in cultures that historically suppressed left-handedness through social pressure or active correction of left-handed children, suggesting the developmental pathway is robust against environmental modification. Third, evolutionary biology doesn't have a clean explanation for why a minority variant has been maintained at a stable frequency rather than being selected against or for. The most developed evolutionary explanation for the 10% rate involves frequency-dependent selection. The argument that in a population where almost everyone is right-handed, a minority of left-handers has advantages in one-on-one physical competition because their opponent's strategies are calibrated for right-handed opponents. The evidence for this comes from combat sports and martial arts, where left-handers are significantly overrepresented at elite levels. Under this framework, the stable 10% represents an equilibrium, enough left-handers to benefit from the surprise advantage, not so many that the advantage disappears as opponents learn to compensate. This is a plausible explanation that remains not definitively confirmed. The consistency of the 10% rate across every studied human population is one of those facts that becomes stranger the more you think about what it would require to produce it. Story 20 fingerprint uniqueness has never been proven. It's an assumption based on never having found a match. The claim that no two fingerprints are alike is foundational to forensic science. It has been treated as established fact for over a century, used in millions of criminal prosecutions, and presented to juries as certainty rather than probability. It is also, strictly speaking, unproven. The claim has not been mathematically proved from first principles. The number of possible fingerprint configurations has been estimated. Friction-ridged skin can vary in its ridge count, bifurcations, endings, and other minutiae in ways that produce a very large number of possible configurations. And that large number is used to argue that the probability of two people having identical fingerprints is negligibly small. But a probability is not a proof, and the calculation depends on assumptions about how fingerprint features are distributed that are themselves based on empirical studies rather than mathematical certainty. What is actually the case? In the billions of fingerprints that have been cataloged and compared, no two identical fingerprints from different people have ever been confirmed. This is the evidential basis for the claim. Not mathematical proof, but the absence of a confirmed counterexample. The National Academy of Sciences released a major report in 2009, strengthening forensic science in the United States, that specifically noted that fingerprint analysis lacked the scientific foundation that its forensic presentation claimed, that its error rates were not established, and that examiner testimony overstated the certainty of fingerprint identification. The Daubert standard for scientific evidence in U.S. courts is supposed to require that forensic methods have established error rates. Fingerprint analysis, as currently practiced, does not have such rates established in the peer-reviewed literature. Fingerprints are very useful forensic evidence. That they are unique is the assumption we've never actually proved. Story 21 ball lightning has been reported for centuries and photographed recently, and nobody has reproduced it in a lab. Ball lightning is one of those phenomena that spent much of the 20th century in an uncomfortable zone, too consistently reported by too many credible witnesses to dismiss, too impossible to reliably produce in controlled conditions to confirm through the standard experimental route. The reports have a consistent phenomenology, a luminous sphere ranging from golf ball to beach ball size, typically appearing during or after thunderstorms, floating through the air, sometimes passing through closed windows or walls, lasting anywhere from seconds to minutes, and disappearing silently or with a bang. The color ranges through the spectrum. Some accounts describe a metallic or sulfurous smell. In 2012, Chinese researchers studying the optical spectra of natural lightning accidentally captured on camera and spectrometer a ball of light that formed after a lightning strike, lasted for approximately 1.6 seconds, moved horizontally, and emitted a spectrum containing silicon, iron, and calcium, elements consistent with the soil the lightning had struck. This was the first spectroscopic data on a natural ball lightning event and was published in Physical Review Letters. The spectroscopic data is consistent with one proposed mechanism: plasma formed from vaporous soil minerals, but is not consistent with all observed properties of all reported ball lightning events. Balls that pass through glass, that appear in locations far from lightning, that last much longer than plasma could realistically sustain under ambient conditions. These properties strain the vaporous soil plasma explanation. Other proposed mechanisms include microwave-induced plasma, quantum vacuum coherence effects, and burning silicon nanoparticles. None produces all reported properties reliably in laboratory conditions. The thing is real, photographed, and spectroscopically measured. The mechanism that produces it is still debated. Story 22: Universal Newborn Cry Patterns. Babies around the world cry the same way before anyone has taught them to. Newborn infants cry before they have had any exposure to language or to the vocal patterns of their culture. They cry within minutes of birth, before any social learning has occurred, and with no ability to have learned anything about what human vocalization should sound like. Research on the acoustic structure of newborn cries has found that infants from different language backgrounds, German-speaking families, French-speaking families, Mandarin-speaking families, families speaking tonal and non-tonal languages, produce cries whose melodic contours are influenced by their parents' native language. German newborns tend to produce cries that fall in pitch at the end. French newborns tend to produce cries that rise. Mandarin-speaking parent newborns show patterns consistent with tonal influence. This finding is extraordinary because it implies that infants have been listening and learning prosodic patterns from the muffled sound of their parents' speech in utero, and are already producing vocalizations that reflect those patterns within hours of birth. The auditory system is functional in the third trimester of pregnancy, but beyond the language-specific variations, there is an underlying universal acoustic structure to human newborn cries: specific frequency contours, specific temporal patterns, specific harmonic structures that appear across all populations and that appear to be hardwired rather than learnt. The universal elements presumably reflect what crying is for evolutionarily: a signal to caregivers, optimized over evolutionary time to be aversive enough to compel attention without being so aversive that caregivers flee. The specific evolutionary pressures that shape the universal cry pattern and the neurological basis of the prenatal learning that produces the language-specific variations are still being worked out. Newborns already know things nobody taught them. Story 23: Unexplained Skyquakes. Booming sounds with no source have been reported globally for centuries. Seneca, writing in the 1st century CE, described mysterious booming sounds from clear skies. Native Americans of the Atlantic coast had traditions about deep booming sounds from the ocean that they called barricel guns. Flemish sailors in the early modern period called similar sounds mist poofers, fog belches. In the early 20th century, residents of Alabama and Georgia reported booming sounds they called water hammers. The U.S. Navy has documented unexplained booming sounds on the East Coast. Similar reports come from the coast of Belgium, from Japan, from Australia, from various Pacific Island communities. These sounds, typically described as a deep, resonant boom without visual accompaniment, occurring once or in short sequences, sometimes feeling like ground vibration, sometimes heard without being felt, are called skyquakes in modern usage, and their causes span a range of explanations, some confirmed and some not. The confirmed causes include sonic booms from aircraft or re-entering space debris, explosions from military or industrial activity, earthquakes and their acoustic waves, and meteors or bolides entering the atmosphere. Many documented skyquakes have been attributed to these causes after investigation. The ones that aren't attributed are the interesting ones: clusters of reports in specific geographic areas, at times with no corresponding military activity, no identified aircraft, no seismic event. These remain unexplained. Some researchers have proposed that they reflect atmospheric acoustic phenomena, including the propagation of sounds from distant sources in specific temperature inversion conditions that focus sound in unusual ways. Some propose they reflect offshore geological events. None of these explanations accounts for all documented cases. The Seneca guns of the American East Coast are among the most persistent clusters. They have been investigated repeatedly and explained approximately. They keep happening. Story 24, human circadian rhythm, is 2 hours, and that 12 minutes of error matters more than it sounds when humans are isolated from all external time cues, constant light or darkness, no clocks, no social contact that carries temporal information. The internal body clock that regulates their sleep-wake cycle does not default to exactly 24 hours. It defaults to approximately 24.2 hours. The average across multiple studies is in the range of 24.1 to 24.5 hours, with 24.2 being frequently cited. This means the human circadian clock runs slightly fast relative to the actual rotation period of the Earth. Left unentrained by external cues, a person would naturally drift, sleeping slightly later each day, waking slightly later, gradually rotating around the clock over the course of weeks. The specific offset of approximately 12 minutes is not arbitrary. It's a consistent, heritable property of human circadian biology. The molecular clock mechanism that produces it has been extensively characterized, and the approximately 24 2-hour period is a property of that molecular mechanism. What isn't settled is the evolutionary reason for the specific offset. Several proposals exist that the slightly longer than 24-hour period makes it easier for the clock to be entrained by morning light, that the specific offset reflects the period when human ancestors' environments had different day-length properties, or that the offset serves some functional purpose in allowing flexibility of sleep timing. None of these explanations is definitively established. The human clock is wrong by 12 minutes per day. It corrects itself by the light of morning. What the 12 minutes of error is doing there, whether it's an adaptation or an imperfection, is genuinely uncertain. Story 25, sea star wasting disease. An entire keystone species collapsed simultaneously up a 3,000-mile coastline in the summer of 2013. Sea stars, starfish, along the Pacific coast of North America began dying. The disease appeared as tissue melting. The animals developed lesions, lost the ability to use their tube feet, and dissolved in place over the course of days. The die-off began in Washington state and spread simultaneously north toward Alaska and south toward Baja California, reaching catastrophic levels by 2014. At peak, the wasting disease caused population declines of 80 to 100% for several sea star species across a 3,000-mile stretch of coastline. Some species, including the ochre sea star and the sunflower sea star, experienced losses so severe that their remaining populations were a fraction of pre-2013 levels. The sunflower sea star was subsequently listed as critically endangered globally. Sea stars are keystone species in Pacific intertidal ecosystems. Their predation on mussels and urchins prevents those species from competitively excluding others. Their collapse had cascading effects on the ecosystems they had regulated. A densovirus, a type of single-stranded virus, was identified as a leading suspect. Experimental work demonstrated that injecting sea star tissue with viral material could induce the disease. But the connection is more complicated than a simple infectious disease outbreak would be. The virus appears to have been present in sea star populations before 2013, including in museum specimens from decades earlier, and the specific trigger that caused it to become pathogenic in 2013 is not established. Elevated ocean temperatures have been associated with the outbreak's severity, and the 2013 marine heat wave in the Pacific may have reduced sea star immune function or increased virus replication. Why 2013, on that scale, affecting that range simultaneously, remains incompletely understood. Story 26, the dragon myth problem. Every ancient culture invented a giant reptile monster, and some think they saw fossils, giant serpents, and winged reptilian monsters appear independently in the mythologies of ancient China, ancient Mesopotamia, ancient India, pre-Columbian Mesoamerica, ancient Europe, Aboriginal Australia, and sub-Saharan Africa, among others. The specific details differ. Chinese dragons are benevolent. European dragons hoard treasure. Mesopotamian chaos dragons are primordial. But the core imagery of a large, intelligent, sometimes winged reptile is sufficiently consistent across cultures that its independent invention in each location invites explanation. The most straightforward explanation is that large reptiles exist and have always existed. Nile crocodiles, large pythons and anacondas, monitor lizards, actual giant reptiles that would make an impression on any human population that encountered them, and that could plausibly inspire mythological elaboration. The fossil hypothesis is more specific and more debated, that ancient peoples regularly encountered the fossils of dinosaurs and other prehistoric reptiles, and that dragon mythology emerged partly from attempts to make sense of those large, impressive, clearly animal bones. The geologist and historian Adrienne Mayer has developed this argument extensively in her book The First Fossil Hunters, pointing out that many regions with strong dragon traditions are also regions with significant exposed fossil beds, and that ancient accounts of griffin encounters correspond geographically to Protoceratops fossil deposits in Central Asia. Whether ancient people actually understood fossil bones as evidence of large creatures that once lived, or whether they interpreted them as other things, is contested. Whether the correlation between fossil availability and monster mythology is strong enough to be causal rather than coincidental is a debate that hasn't settled. The similarity of the myths across cultures without contact is the data. Explaining it is the problem. Story 27 White Nose Syndrome spread map doesn't follow bat migration routes, and researchers are puzzled. White nose syndrome, caused by the fungus Pseudogymnoascus destructans, has killed an estimated 6 to 7 million North American bats since it was first detected in a New York cave in 2006. The disease kills hibernating bats by disrupting their torpor, causing them to burn through their winter fat reserves and starve. Some hibernacula have seen 90 to 100% mortality of their bat populations. The disease's spread from its initial detection site in New York has been extensively tracked, and the geographic pattern of spread is one of the things that puzzles researchers most about the outbreak. The fungus was presumably introduced from Europe, where PD is present in bat populations without causing mass mortality, suggesting European bats have evolved some resistance, and has since spread across eastern North America and is now moving westward. The problem: the spread pattern doesn't cleanly follow expected bat dispersal routes. Bats move between hibernacula in patterns that cave biologists have studied through banding and, more recently, acoustic and pit tag monitoring. The movement of the disease across the landscape jumps ahead of where those documented bat movement patterns would predict, appearing in locations that aren't obviously connected to previously infected sites through known bat travel routes. Some of this may reflect incomplete knowledge of bat movement. There are more bats moving longer distances than banding studies captured. Some may reflect human transmission, with cavers inadvertently carrying fungal spores between caves on their clothing and equipment. Some researchers have proposed that airborne dispersal of spores over short distances between caves may also contribute. The specific gap between the observed spread pattern and the predicted spread pattern from known bat movements is one of the things that continues to puzzle disease ecologists working on the outbreak. Story 28, the anniversary effect and mortality. Some studies find people slightly more likely to die after a meaningful data-specific and strange statistical pattern has appeared in several epidemiological studies. Terminally ill patients appear, in some datasets, to be slightly more likely to die in the days and weeks following a personally significant date, a birthday, a major holiday, a wedding anniversary, than in the equivalent period preceding it. This proposed phenomenon is sometimes called the anniversary effect or the birthday effect. It has been documented in several datasets and dismissed or not replicated in others, which is exactly the kind of mixed replication history that makes it genuinely difficult to assess. The effect, if real, would imply that the timing of death has some degree of psychological or volitional component, that terminally ill people can, through some mechanism not yet understood, delay death until after a personally significant date. The effect has been proposed to work in both directions: higher mortality just after significant dates and lower mortality just before. The mechanism that would explain this is genuinely unclear. Terminal illness involves progressive physiological failure that is not obviously influenced by psychological timing in the way this effect would require. Proposed explanations involve changes in immune function correlated with psychological state, changes in treatment compliance or caregiving intensity around significant dates, and simple selection effects in which people who die around significant dates are more notable and more memorable. The mixed replication history leaves the phenomenon in an uncomfortable evidential position. Probably not a strong or reliable effect, possibly not an effect at all, but appearing consistently enough in some datasets that the question hasn't been fully settled. Story 29 synesthesia's gene is missing, a neurological trait with family clustering that no single gene explains synesthesia, the neurological condition in which stimulation of one sensory pathway produces automatic, involuntary experiences in another, is reported by approximately 2 to 4% of the population. It is more common in certain families. First-degree relatives of synesthetes are significantly more likely to be synesthetes themselves than the general population. This pattern strongly suggests a genetic component. After decades of genetic research, no single synesthesia gene has been identified, despite the familial clustering that should make this tractable. The genome-wide association studies and candidate gene studies that have been conducted have found suggestive associations in a handful of regions, but nothing that cleanly explains the inheritance pattern or that replicates reliably across different study populations. The most recent large-scale genetic studies have found evidence of multiple genes with small individual effects that together contribute to synesthetic experience, a complex polygenic architecture rather than the simpler pattern that researchers initially expected. The diversity of synesthesia types complicates the genetics. The condition includes at least 80 documented subtypes, different source to target pairings, and it's not clear whether different subtypes share the same genetic basis or whether each type has distinct genetic influences. The experience itself is extraordinarily vivid and specific to the individual. A synesthete who experiences the number 7 as yellow will experience it as the same yellow every time, consistently, automatically, across their lifetime. The consistency of the experience is unusual. The genetics that produce it are not yet understood. Story 30, the uncanny valley, is real across all cultures, and nobody fully understands the evolutionary root the uncanny valley, the specific discomfort that humans feel when encountering almost but not quite human faces, whether in robots, CGI characters, mannequins, or heavily restored corpses, was named by Japanese roboticist Masahiro Mori in 1970, based on his observation that human affinity for robots increased with their human likeness until a certain threshold, at which point affinity dropped sharply before recovering again as the robot became indistinguishable from human. The phenomenon is real and has been documented in experimental studies across multiple cultures, including populations in Japan, the United States, and several other countries. The consistency of the response across cultures with different aesthetic traditions and different levels of exposure to robotics suggests that it reflects something evolutionarily ancient rather than culturally specific. The evolutionary explanations that have been proposed are several. 1. The uncanny valley response is a hyperactive pathogen detection system. The same cognitive mechanisms that make diseased or parasitized humans look off are triggered by almost human faces, and the discomfort is an evolved response to avoid contact with the potentially ill. 2. The uncanny valley is a conspecific recognition system, a system for identifying other humans, misfiring when presented with something that is almost human. 3. It reflects a processing disfluency response, in which the mismatch between the expected and actual properties of a stimulus produces discomfort. These explanations predict different things about exactly which properties of a face trigger the valley most strongly, and why. The experimental evidence doesn't clearly favor one over the others. The discomfort is real. Its evolutionary root is genuinely contested among the researchers who study it. Story 31, the Monday effect in stock markets, has persisted for decades despite everyone knowing about it. The Monday effect is a documented anomaly in financial markets. Average stock returns on Mondays are, historically, measurably lower than returns on other trading days. The effect has been present in U.S. market data across different time periods, has been documented in international markets, and has been studied extensively since it was first formally described in the financial economics literature in the 1970s. The specific puzzle is not just that the effect exists, but that it has persisted despite being well known. The efficient markets hypothesis, the foundational assumption of much financial economics, holds that systematically exploitable patterns in market returns should be arbitraged away once they're identified. If returns on Mondays are reliably lower, rational investors should sell before weekends and buy on Monday dips. And this trading activity should eliminate the pattern. The pattern hasn't been eliminated. It has diminished somewhat in more recent data relative to earlier periods, possibly reflecting increasing market efficiency or a change in market structure. But it hasn't disappeared. The proposed explanations for why the pattern exists in the first place include: information about company problems tends to be released on Fridays after market close, accumulating over weekends to produce negative Monday openings. Investor psychology, including mood effects and settlement timing effects in how weekend non-trading days interact with clearing systems. None of these explanations fully accounts for the pattern across all markets and all time periods it's been observed. A robust statistical pattern in one of the most intensively studied data sources in the world, for which the mechanism hasn't been cleanly identified, has persisted for decades. This is the kind of thing that should bother efficient market theorists. It does. Story 32, Vasco. A survey found stars present in the 1950s that simply aren't there anymore. The Vanishing and Appearing Sources during a Century of Observations project, Vasco, is a systematic comparison of photographic sky survey images from the 1950s against modern digital sky surveys, specifically designed to find objects that were present in the historical data and are absent in the modern data, or vice versa. The project found approximately 100 candidate vanishing point sources, objects visible in the historical plates that have no counterpart in the modern surveys. The project also found objects that appear to have appeared, not present in the historical data, visible in modern surveys. The mundane explanation for most of these candidates, photographic plates from the 1950s, are noisy. Emulsion defects, cosmic ray hits, and processing artifacts can create false detections that look like point sources in the scans. The expected false detection rate from these sources could plausibly account for most or all of the 100 candidates. The interesting explanation: for the candidates that survive scrutiny, some of these could represent real transient phenomena, stars that underwent outbursts detectable in the photographic bandpass and then returned to quiescence, or genuinely variable sources that happened to be bright during the historical survey window. Some could represent stars that actually no longer exist, unusual events like direct collapses to black holes without a bright supernova phase. A small number of the Vasco candidates have been examined more carefully and remain without a satisfying, mundane explanation. Whether they represent real astrophysical transients or subtle artifacts of the plate-to-digital comparison process is still being investigated. The stars that are there in the 1950s and not there now are the interesting ones. There aren't many of them. They're enough. Story 33, the homing pigeon disruption days. On specific dates, thousands of birds get lost simultaneously. Homing pigeons navigate home from release sites through a combination of mechanisms that have been studied for decades. magnetic field sensing, olfactory cues, visual landmarks, and sun compass. Under normal conditions, trained racing pigeons return home from release sites hundreds of kilometers away with high reliability. Occasionally, they don't. Racing loft records going back decades document specific dates on which large numbers of pigeons released from multiple sites across a region failed to return home at rates far above the normal loss rate. The losses cluster. It's not individual birds getting lost sporadically, but hundreds of birds from many different lofts, released at different locations, failing simultaneously on the same day. The correlation between these disruption events and solar activity has been investigated. Solar storms, particularly X-class solar flares and associated coronal mass ejections, disrupt the Earth's magnetic field. The magnetosphere changes character. For animals that navigate using the magnetic field, this could plausibly produce navigational disorientation. The correlation between pigeon disruption events and recorded solar storm activity is positive. There are more disruption events around periods of high solar activity, but the correlation is not clean. Not every solar storm produces disruption events. Some disruption events don't correlate with identified solar activity. The relationship is suggestive, but not definitively causal. The pigeons that don't come home on those specific days are in most cases never found. They don't arrive home. They don't show up dead. They are simply gone on the same day from release sites across a region on dates that keep recurring in the records with no clean explanation. Story 34, Ferb clustering across the sky, doesn't match the distribution of galaxies, and that's odd-fast radio bursts, originate at cosmological distances, billions of light years away, and are detected at rates that by now include hundreds of confirmed events. Given their cosmological origin, their distribution across the sky should, at the very large scale, approximately reflect the large-scale structure of the universe, the same web of galaxy filaments, clusters, and voids that we see in galaxy surveys. Some analyses of Ferb sky position data have found patterns in the clustering of Ferb detections that don't match expected distributions based on known galaxy clusters and large-scale structure maps. The statistical significance of these clustering signals is debated, and the small sample size of well-localized FRBs makes interpretation difficult. Most FRBs are detected with positional uncertainty too large to localize to a specific galaxy. There are several possible explanations for anomalous clustering, none of which requires exotic physics. Selection effects from the antenna patterns and detection thresholds of specific telescopes could create apparent sky clustering that doesn't reflect the true distribution. Propagation effects, the Ferb signal is affected by the ionized gas it passes through, could enhance or suppress detection from specific sky directions in ways not fully modeled. The possibility that the clustering reflects a real overdensity of Ferb sources in specific cosmic regions, that something about the large-scale structure of the universe preferentially produces FRBs in some places more than others, would require an explanation for why. The dataset is still small enough that this question may resolve with more detections. Current facilities are increasing detection rates dramatically. The clustering pattern may sharpen into something explicable, or it may remain anomalous. Story 35, the specific pattern researchers have actually noticed. The universe is full of questions that are the same shape we've been through 34 unsolved patterns. Particles passing through the Earth, a bubble of absence a billion light years across, a repeating radio signal on a 16-day schedule, bees dissolving on a coastline simultaneously, cicadas counting prime numbers underground, a sound that 2% of people can hear and nobody can find, a cold patch in the oldest light in the universe, new skills appearing after head injuries, a dozen dragon myths from cultures that never met. The specific thing that becomes apparent looking at all of them together is not the content of any individual mystery. It's the shape. Each one of these patterns was found not by looking for something strange, but by looking carefully at something ordinary and noticing that the numbers didn't add up. The Anita researchers were looking for cosmic ray signatures, The Vasco project was looking for variable stars. The beekeepers just had hives that were empty. The epidemiologists were tracking mortality and noticed a day-of-week pattern. The pattern you find when you're looking for it is always less interesting than the pattern you find when you're looking for something else. What the research community is actually doing at every scale, in every discipline, is generating data that exceeds its current theoretical frameworks. The standard model of particle physics doesn't account for Anita. The efficient markets hypothesis doesn't account for the Monday effect. Standard evolutionary biology doesn't fully account for prime number life cycles. Standard neuroscience doesn't fully account for acquired savant syndrome. The universe keeps producing data that doesn't fit. That's not a sign something is wrong with the universe. It's a sign that the frameworks are maps, and maps always leave things out. The unsolved patterns are where the edges of the map are. They're the most interesting place to be. Story 36, the Mpemba effect. Hot water sometimes freezes faster than cold water, and nobody has agreed why. In 1963, a Tanzanian schoolboy named Erasto Mpemba noticed that hot ice cream mix placed in a freezer solidified faster than cold mix. His physics teacher dismissed the observation. He persisted, eventually bringing it to the attention of physicist Denis Osborne, who investigated, confirmed the effect under certain conditions, and published it with Mpemba as co-author in 1969. The Mpemba effect, the observation that a hotter liquid can, under specific conditions, freeze faster than a cooler liquid starting from the same initial container and freezer, has been reproduced in laboratory settings and has also failed to replicate in others. The experimental literature is genuinely inconsistent, not because some researchers are incompetent, but because the effect appears to be sensitive to conditions that are difficult to control precisely. Container geometry, dissolved gas content, water purity, the specific temperature differential, and the specific cooling rate. The proposed mechanisms span a range. Evaporative cooling. Hotter water evaporates more during the cooling process, reducing its mass and allowing the smaller remaining volume to freeze faster. Dissolved gas. Hot water contains less dissolved gas than cold water. Dissolved gas may inhibit freezing. Supercooling. Cold water may be more prone to supercooling, remaining liquid below 0 C before finally freezing, while hot water freezes more directly at 0 C. Hydrogen bond restructuring. A 2016 paper proposed that hydrogen bonds between water molecules are stretched differently in hot versus cold water in ways that affect freezing dynamics. No single mechanism has achieved consensus. The Royal Society of Chemistry ran a competition in 2012 for the best explanation and received 22,000 entries. They selected a winner. Physicists continued to disagree. A schoolboy noticed something real in 1963. 60 years of research has not fully explained it. Story 37, the placebo effect, gets stronger over time, and nobody knows what that means for medicine. The placebo effect, the documented improvement in patient outcomes produced by inactive treatments, is not a fixed quantity. Analysis of clinical trial data over the past several decades has revealed something unexpected. The average placebo response in certain categories of clinical trials has been increasing over time. The patients in the placebo arms of antidepressant and pain trials today show stronger responses than patients in equivalent trials from the 1980s, even though the placebos themselves are identical. This is specifically documented in the pain medicine literature and in psychiatric drug trials. A 2015 analysis by Jeffrey Mogel's group found that placebo response rates in pain trials conducted in the United States had increased substantially over the past 25 years, while European trial placebo responses had not shown the same trend. The effect appears to be geographically specific and temporally specific. Something has changed about American patients' responses to placebo treatments in the context of clinical trials. The implications are significant and uncomfortable for drug development. If placebo responses are increasing, the bar for demonstrating that an active drug produces effects above placebo is rising. Drugs that would have shown clear superiority to placebo in a 1990 trial may not show it against the stronger placebo responses of today. Some researchers have suggested that several drug classes may need to be retested against modern placebo baselines. The proposed explanations include increased direct-to-consumer pharmaceutical advertising, changes in trial design and patient-researcher relationships, and shifts in how patients in trials are recruited and treated. Whatever it reflects, the finding that the human expectation of improvement has become more biologically powerful over time is one of the stranger things medicine has documented. Story 38: Monarch Butterfly Navigation. They find a forest they've never seen using information nobody has identified every autumn. Monarch butterflies east of the Rocky Mountains migrate from as far north as Canada to a cluster of forest groves in the mountains of central Mexico, specifically the Oyamel fir forests of Michoacan State, a destination covering only a few square kilometers in a country 3,000 kilometers away. In spring, the surviving butterflies head north, and their offspring and the offspring of those offspring eventually reach the breeding grounds that the original migrants left. The navigation problem is the genuinely strange part. The butterflies that make the southward autumn migration have never been to Mexico. They were born after the previous generation departed. No individual butterfly makes the round trip. The southward migrants and the northward migrants are different generations, sometimes 2 or 3 generations removed. Whatever directional information guides them to the specific Mexican grove cannot have come from prior personal experience. Monarch navigation uses a time-compensated sun compass. They track the sun's position and adjust for the time of day to maintain a consistent southwest heading. This is understood and well documented. What is not fully understood is how they find the specific destination once they enter the general region. The final navigation to the specific grove location appears to use additional cues that may include the magnetic field, olfactory signals, or geographic landmarks. The relative contributions of each are still being worked out. The deeper puzzle: how is the destination encoded in the first place? Whatever represents Michoacan fir forest in the monarch genome is inherited information about a location the inheriting butterfly has never visited. The encoding of a specific geographic destination across generations without any individual completing the full journey is the part that doesn't have a fully satisfying mechanistic account. Story 39: The Wow. Signal: 45 seconds of something from space in 1977 that was never heard again. On August 15, 1977, astronomer Jerry Eman was reviewing data from the Big Ear radio telescope at Ohio State University when he noticed a sequence of signal intensities that made him circle the printout and write "wow" in the margin. The signal had lasted approximately 72 seconds, the duration of a star remaining in the telescope's field of view as the Earth rotated, and was so strong and so precisely at the frequency that radio astronomers had theoretically identified as the most likely frequency for deliberate interstellar communication that Eman's instinctive response has given the signal its permanent name. The wow signal appeared to come from the direction of the constellation Sagittarius. At a frequency of 1420-405 mH, the emission frequency of neutral hydrogen, which is quiet in radio terms, and therefore potentially useful as a channel for deliberate communication. It showed the characteristic rise and fall in intensity that would be expected from a fixed-point source in space moving through the telescope's beam. It was, in every measurable property, what a signal from an extraterrestrial transmitter would look like. It has never been detected again. Dozens of subsequent observations of the same sky region with the same and more sensitive equipment have found nothing. No repeating signal, no consistent source, nothing that would allow the original detection to be confirmed or studied further. The most discussed mundane explanation, that the signal came from a passing comet's hydrogen envelope, was proposed in 2017 and remains contested. 2 comets were in approximately the right sky region in August 1977, but matching the signal properties to cometary hydrogen emission requires assumptions that some radio astronomers dispute. The wow signal was real. The source was never identified. it hasn't happened again. Story 40, the sleeping sickness epidemic of 1917. A neurological disease appeared globally, then vanished, and left no cause between 1917 and 1927. An epidemic of a neurological disease called encephalitis lethargica swept the world, affecting an estimated 5 million people and killing roughly a third of them. The survivors were frequently left in a state of profound neurological impairment, suspended in what neurologist Oliver Sacks, who worked with surviving patients decades later, described as a state between sleeping and waking, responsive to stimulation but unable to initiate voluntary movement or speech. The disease's symptoms were bizarre in their variety. Some patients developed extreme somnolence, sleeping for months. Others developed the opposite, extreme insomnia and agitation. Some developed oculogyric crises, episodes in which the eyes rolled involuntarily upward and locked. Some developed post-encephalitic Parkinsonism, a condition resembling Parkinson's disease that appeared years after the initial illness. And then, as suddenly as it had appeared, the epidemic ended. By the late 1920s, new cases had essentially stopped. The cause was never definitively identified. The timing, beginning during or just after the 1918 influenza pandemic, led to suspicion that influenza was involved, directly or by triggering an autoimmune response. But encephalitis lethargica cases had been documented before the 1918 flu. An epidemiological analysis has failed to establish a clean correlation between influenza and encephalitis lethargica cases. A streptococcal autoimmune mechanism has been proposed and has some supporting evidence from occasional modern cases. No pathogen has ever been isolated from the epidemic-era cases. The patients Oliver Sacks treated in the 1960s with the drug L-Dopa, described in his book Awakenings, had been suspended in their neurological state for 40 years. The disease that put them there is still not understood.